I want to welcome you all to the annual conference for the Council for International Development. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Tā alofa, ono mai, paki te mai te malu ko au fia.
It seems fitting that this conference is themed Stronger Relationships and Resilience. Because if there is anything that we have learned over the past year and a half, it is the importance of genuine relationships in building resilience. In fact, positive relationships are key to resilience. An approach where partners can put aside their own agendas and be willing to work collaboratively for the good of the recipient is needed. You may be surprised at how good Pacific countries can be at coordinating different partners themselves to work towards their own development priorities. These sentiments are not new. Principles such as country leadership and ownership, predictability of funding cycles, the use of country systems, coordination, harmonization, technical assistance, monitoring and evaluation have been talked about for years. Yet, we still have fundamental fractures in the delivery of aid to the Pacific. The new way to work in the Pacific is to bring to life these old principles by practicing them, aligning to our Pacific values, which of course means not just listening, but hearing us. Engagement with the Pacific Islands must be genuine and must bring all parties involved to the table. With respect, this is something that all countries currently engaged with the region have failed at multiple times in the past. This COVID crisis is an opportunity to put things right. COVID-19 is evolving into a long-term emergency, unlike any other that the modern world has experienced before. Its effects will manifest differently relative to a country's ability to cope. From the Cook Islands perspective, returning to a pre-COVID world is a return to development that is simply not fit for the future. Tourism will always be important to the Cook Islands and will be the quickest way for the country to bounce back. But it can no longer be our only primary industry. We will have to look at other sectors, such as fisheries, trade, financial services, the creative economy, and seabed minerals, all while ensuring that we can balance fiscal priorities between stimulus measures and the measures intended to raise revenue and incentives to shift behaviour. I am under no illusion that this will be an easy task. This COVID crisis is playing out in the intersection of the changing climate, all the while challenging our resilience. Unfortunately, due to the ramifications of COVID-19, the Cook Islands, like some other Pacific countries, cannot send a full-fledged delegation to COP26. But our message has not changed from Paris in 2015. It is not the Pacific Island countries that are needed to make a difference in reducing carbon emissions. It is not us that must change how we do things to keep the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. It is the larger developed countries and the major emitting countries. Many of us in the Pacific have done our bit on mitigation by converting to renewable energy, even though our emissions amount to a match flame in a forest fire. So no, we won't be at COP26 in person. No, our focus is on building resilience and adaptation, as we have been proclaiming for all these past COP meetings. Right now, we are building the banks of our streams higher to protect homes that for the first time in our history are being reached by floodwater. We are building water storage on islands that have never before experienced levels of drought that we see now. We're busy finding ways to protect ourselves against the impact of climate change that we are experiencing now. And we are turning to our mineral wealth lying in our ocean depths to provide us the means to pay for resilience. We are putting our minds towards innovative financing modalities that do not increase our debt, a debt that has grown due to COVID-19. The Cook Islands, like other small island states, are at the front line of the climate emergency, and COVID-19 is amplifying existing uncertainty and risk. It has re-emphasized the importance of resilience. Our priorities for COP26 are still aligned with the region's position on calling for greater emission targets and actions to keep the 1.5 degree limit alive. And we look forward to the commitment from the major emitting countries on what they will do to meet this target. It will not be easy, but it does require action, and action now, not later.
Your theme for this year's conference, as New Ways of Working, Building Better Relationships and Resilience, is the clue as to why the Council for International Development is on a mission to change the face of New Zealand aid and development. That you have proposed to ensure inclusiveness of the Pacific organizations and Pacific diaspora professionals in New Zealand to join the CID membership, as well as ensure Pacific partners are at the table where policies are discussed and remain actively engaged, are sure steps towards consolidating the aid transformation. After all, bringing everyone to the table ensures no one is left behind. This is a robust measure of how effective development cooperation is. Climate change, COVID-19 recovery, and many other sustainable development challenges stand before us in the years ahead. These challenges cannot and should not be tackled alone. From my government's perspective, all development partners must be invited to the table to address the challenges, and that the government must lead. We know the private sector, the local non-government actors, and all our stakeholders are innovative and creative. We need to consider how we can leverage these ideas and skills to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, while also recognizing the need for companies to make a profit and the non-governmental actors to determine a mutually beneficial niche for them. Working together is a win-win approach based on shared value creation. I do note that the values platform of your council augur well for durable and equitable partnerships, and that you are suitably placed to provide the analysis, facilitate networks with the Government of New Zealand, and provide discussion documents on development and New Zealand's development sector. As COVID-19 continues without an end in sight, and as the Pacific approaches the cyclone season, it is important to consider the fact that this is an important opportunity to further strengthen localized humanitarian action in the Pacific. Non-government actors at both national and regional levels are at the center of the localization discourse in the region, given the recognition of their pivotal and complementary role to government and the strength of humanitarian action in the Pacific.
Manuia te waiaho o te ngangana tukelau. I acknowledge that it is Tukelauan Language Week this week, and I would like to share a proverb from our Tukelauan brothers and sisters. Tauwa ki tō lumanaki nei, Mataʻafa ki nā mea lele uma. Determine your future now by taking hold of working opportunities. My name is Afamasaga Jackie Kari, and I will be the facilitator of this panel today.
What I have experienced over time is that they are doing to us, for us. And what we would like to say is that that time is over. The Cook Island Prime Minister really hit home that fact, that we need to redefine what our new relationships are about. What I'm seeing in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is that Māori are still an afterthought in many respects. Pasifika people are still an afterthought in many respects. So when projects are delivered in our various countries, these organisations go with not necessarily an understanding of who we actually are. The diaspora has a huge role to play in that space. Why? Because we have cultural capital. Why? Because we are linked to our countries through our ainga connections, through our villages, and through who we are.
In terms of localization, so we had been working with a partner humanitarian advisory group in Australia, because we recognize what research does. You know how if there is any new projects that donor wanted to support, what they do, they send a whole lot of consultants with a predetermined agenda to look for things that they want to see. Yeah. So we need to take this back. We need to do our own research. We need to define our own priorities, and that's what we have done. We changed our narrative and we said, okay, if we talk localization, we have 7 key areas that we want to donors to come, or even international NGOs to come in and look at it from our lens. Yeah. One is partnership. One is leadership. We talk about capacity. We talk about the coordination and complementarity. We talk about funding, and we talk about policy influence and advocacy, and we talk about participation. So these are the key areas that we say, talk about localization, this is it. We want to define together what does this mean in terms of working around localization.
It's kind of like we're talking about shifting from not just project to program, but actually program to process. And what you're describing, Jen, and what you work in terms of the Balance of Power project, which is about, you know, not just getting women into positions of power in the Pacific, but getting people to vote for women who stand for positions of power. So you're changing social norms. So, and we know this in our own political environments in our own countries, but we don't apply the same lens sometimes to development. So how do you, and has COVID helped to get funders and donors to think about funding processes of social change rather than even just programs, let alone projects?
Yes and no. You know, we're in a strange time, and you know, it's taken a few months. Of course, it's taken, you know, over a year for a change to happen, and then a shifting before it settles into whatever that new normal might look like. And in that time, what you find is that many times funders will continue to try and hold on to what they feel is familiar and what they can almost control. And so I guess one of the biggest, probably one of the biggest things or the biggest challenges that we face as a program that is doing social norm change is that there isn't a tangible thing that you can kind of document or count,
report,
quantify as, you know, oh, social norm change happened there. Because it takes a long period of time to track, and it takes incremental shifts and changes, you know, incrementally, where you'd have to take a stand maybe 5 years or 10 years from now to look at those incremental changes and count them as a one consolidated sum. There is definitely an appetite for it, though, because I think one of the things that we continuously tell ourselves is it's a demonstration. It's by demonstration is how you you show that it can be successful. And that's difficult. And it's difficult when you're under the pressure of having to perform as a locally led initiative. And it means that, you know, we need to continue to be advocating for that process on platforms like this one and others. Which I'm not sure if I've answered your question at all.
Yeah, well,
Josie,
I think that's really interesting, because there's a danger, isn't there, Duncan, of everybody agrees localisation needs to happen. It's the question of whether or not we're doing actually the same old thing by remote control. So when you talk about, you know, using other partners in the Pacific that may be genuinely local rather than ones that have been created in order to fit a particular criteria. I mean, hopefully, you would hope that COVID has demonstrated that some of the organisations you mentioned, Duncan, that on the ground that have responded to COVID effectively are not necessarily the ones that either we as aid agencies or donors might traditionally have partnered with.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a book a while back called How Change Happens, but often what I find myself talking about is why change doesn't. Yeah. Often what I find myself talking about is why change doesn't happen, right? And I think that's a really important issue in the aid sector. And for me, it's one useful way is to think about, is it ideas, institutions, or interests which are blocking things changing? And I think on this issue, it's all three. So I think ideas, people have deeply rooted ideas about what is a good thing to fund. And a good thing to fund is something with a concrete outcome, which is semi-predictable, which can be measured and reported against, because everyone's terrified of getting into trouble with their donors, their politicians, whoever is funding the aid system. So you've got a real ideas issue that you have to shift to the idea that it's okay to fund processes. But that requires a lot of institutional innovation, because let's be honest, there are lots of really rubbish processes out there. I work in an NGO. I know I can spend my whole life in meetings which achieve absolutely nothing, which are processes. So you need a rigorous way to measure what are good processes and what are rubbish processes, and to distinguish between the two. And we're not there. You know, everybody can say, well, we've changed the agenda, we've changed the narrative. You know, how do you prove that one way or the other? So the processes are just a bit more, at the moment, a bit more flimsy and hard to pin down than we've distributed a load of blankets. So until you get some element of rigor in the measurement, there's going to be a lot of spin doctors saying, fund my process, and by the way, there are no outcomes at all. So I think that is a really important question. Then on the institutions, so that's the ideas bit, but also institutions need to innovate. And then interests, you need to accept that, you know, if you're a boss of an NGO, of a funder or an NGO, you know, localization means less money coming through. If you're an international NGO, less money coming through you. So we have to change the interest structure so that that seems a good thing, not a bad thing. So there's a bunch of changes which require analysis, not just being a good person, and require politics and seizing moments like the one we've got to flip ideas, interests, and institutions so that we don't go back. But it's not a given at all.
It is my pleasure to welcome former New Zealand Prime Minister, Right Honourable Helen Clark, in a fireside chat with staff journalist, formerly of the Wall Street Journal, Lucy Kramer.
We've got to start with COVID because it's what's defining most of our lives at the moment. I mean, COVID has been a challenge for all of us around the world, but its devastating impact on the poorest countries is huge. Are we doing enough? I mean, these countries, you know, food insecurity is growing, people are losing their jobs. What do we need to be doing, and what do our leaders need to be doing?
So the pandemic has just been a gigantic setback to development, far worse in implications than the global financial crisis and economic and social crisis of back the 2007, 8, 9 period. So we've seen, you know, poverty, extreme poverty, increase again for the first time this century. And the numbers are kind of fluid. You know, it started with the World Bank saying, oh, well, maybe it'll be 50, 60 million people. Now it's widely conceded to be at least 125 million. You more or less equate that with the numbers of people very, very severely hungry, increased numbers as a result of the pandemic.
What do you think is going to happen? I mean, you said that there's been funding that's been cut. Are we going to see, as countries try and come out of the crisis themselves, is that going to be an ongoing problem as well? Do you think that there isn't going to be as much money for aid in these poor countries?
It depends whether Western countries, who are the traditional donor community, see the big picture. And just as we're saying as a mantra with COVID that none of us are safe until all of us are safe, and don't we see that in our own country? This disease has been allowed to run away and enter the most marginalised communities of people, and that impacts on all of us. Well, the same is true globally. If the disease is running away unmitigated because poor countries can't get access to the vaccine, we run the risk of more challenging variants like the Delta one, and you can envisage that there could be more transmissible, more deadly vaccines than Delta, which also begin to challenge the vaccinations that people have had. So I think it's critical for the donor countries to see the bigger picture, to see that this really is a time, not to be cutting, heavens no, but to be stepping up to support all countries to come through this, because we're going to have a pretty mean little life in our bubbles if we let the world outside the high-income countries just continue to have to wallow in the misery of this. Look, it's disgraceful that still the level of vaccination in sub-Saharan Africa, it would not have exceeded 4% at this point. So, forget about your once in a lifetime holiday to the Okavango Delta or Mount Kilimanjaro. A lot of the world is going to be off limits the longer we act irresponsibly and not in solidarity with all countries recovering from this and coming out of the pandemic. One of the lessons we need to take out of this, of course, is the need for health system strengthening. And one of the strong points made in our panel's report was that because pandemic preparedness and response in toto are global public goods, there needs to be year-on-year investment in these capacities. And it's estimated that the solidarity funding needed for that, for the poorest countries, is probably in the vicinity of 10 to 15 billion a year, which frankly is chicken feed in the overall scheme of things. And then you need to be able to leverage up to 100 billion when an emergency is triggered, and you need to scale up response. It's a question of spending billions to save trillions, and this pandemic has cost trillions. So, I think obviously for a country like Papua New Guinea right now, the immediate focus is on how on earth do you try to slow this rampant transmission? How do you boost vaccination? Fiji, by the way, has got on and, with a lot of support, really has boosted vaccination, and they've had a terrible outbreak. So you want PNG to be able to go down the same track, but we have to resolve, I think, to ensure that PNG is supported to build its basic public health system to be better prepared in future, and that takes investment.
I think COVID bringing some positive changes in the Pacific, as far as borders have closed, there's been a sort of increase of more sort of voices from the Pacific talking about what they need and what their priorities are. We've also seen aid locally being driven by local people. How do we make this business as usual, and how do we make government or organisations more open to listening to these voices and making sure that going forward we are responding to what the Pacific needs, as what Pacific wants, as opposed to what we think the Pacific wants?
Well, I think it's absolutely critical. I'm thinking back sort of close to 2 decades now to when a lot of work was done at the Pacific Islands Forum when we had the chair around 2003 on the Pacific Plan, where the Pacific said, here's our development priorities. God knows what happened to it. But, countries have to lead on their own development. They have to say what it is that are their greatest priorities. And ideally that comes out of interaction with their civil society and broader communities, and isn't just something dreamed up in a poorly capacitated government department. But then countries having established those priorities, then the club of supporters need to work out who will do what. And for New Zealand as a sort of boutique, if you like, aid provider, because we're small too, we work out, what is our niche in that? Where can we add the most value in line with local priorities? And I do agree that because there's been, so much less travel, so much less capacity for the consultants who do so well out of development to be, zipping off here, there, and everywhere. It does bring the local organisations to the fore, and I welcome that, because in the end, it's local buy-in, local capacities, local leadership, which is going to drive sustainable development.
We're going to be taking a closer look at the situation on the ground in Myanmar and examining some of the steps being taken by governments, NGOs, civil society, regional leaders and others to deliver essential support to the people of Myanmar while pushing back against the military. Our conversation is going to be led by 4 outstanding panellists. The Right Honourable Helen Clark, who we've just heard as keynote speaker, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, former Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, and current day leading global advocate for rights, development and democracy. His Excellency Steve Marshall, New Zealand Ambassador to Myanmar since 2016 and former head of the International Labour Office in Myanmar for 8 years. Mr. Ross Wilson, Chair and Founder of Union Aid, former President of the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions and Myanmar Development Specialist. And finally, Dr. Nayant Nai Then, Myanmar consultant and health expert who's joining us from along the Thai-Myanmar border, who is helping to deliver and coordinate essential services to ethnic communities. In 2006, Dr. Nai was awarded the Queen's Service Medal in New Zealand for his outstanding service to refugees and migrants.
New ways to work, stronger relationships and resilience. We've been challenged today from the start of our conference with Prime Minister Mark Brown challenging Pacific countries need to be at the fore of decision making and where funding goes. Prime Minister Fiamē sharing it's been decades of one-sidedness from concept to implementation and looking past our views. To our panel discussions led by Afamasaga, Jackie, Pulotu, Peta, Siale, said to consider the dialogue with the diaspora. Views echoed this afternoon by Dr. Nai in this afternoon's Myanmar session. Right Honourable Helen Clark saying also there, this is not a time for cutting back funding, but for stepping up. And in the words of Emeline Ilolahia from PIANGO saying, let us define our own priorities and define together localisation. New ways to work. COVID offers new opportunities. May we not be in the same place in another 20 years, saying the same talanua, different crisis, but same space. Let us not waste the opportunity this offers. I want to thank the many sponsors that have made today happen. Our keynote speaker, Prime Minister for Samoa, Fiamē Naomi Mataʻafa, it's been a real honour to have you with us today. Cook Islands Prime Minister Mark Brown, Meitaki Ma'ata. Right Honourable Helen Clark, Whaaafetai Lava. And to all of our speakers and panellists, and for those who've also facilitated, we thank you for your contribution. And I want to thank you. Watching online, we appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be with us here. Behind the scenes, there's been a team, a small team, who've been working hard all night. I don't know if they've had any sleep. The Council for International Development team, Philippa Smales, Aaron Davey, Sarah King, and of course, Executive Director, Josie Pagani. Whakawhetai lahi lele. Also to your board members too, we want to acknowledge your work behind the scenes as well. And I'm going to leave you with a farewell. It's been wonderful being with you, and we will see you again next year. Be safe, be well, and be kind. Whawhai lasi lasi. I'll leave you now with the wonderful Reverend Suamalie, who will close our day. Whakawhatailasi tō whākoutou.
Thank you, Malama. I'll just leave you with this smile from my grandmother, just to give you hope, to give you resilience and the challenge to go forward. But why is the world around us keep on squeezing us into its mold? Our Uncle Paul answered, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. It's about time to renew our mind. Because if there is a spiritual renewal, the openness of mind, the openness of heart, and the openness of the spirit, we are able to achieve the holistic approach to life. And that is to build that good relationship to the spiritual world. Secondly, build the good relationship to our environment. Save Tuvalu to save the world. But not forgetting, build a good relationship with love and compassion with the people around us. It's about time for us to act locally and think globally. It's about time for us to do it together, a one family under God. There is a Tuvalu dance. Hikiko te waka, uplift the canoe. Hopo kilunga, hop on the canoe. Alo, 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 kimua. And make sure you paddle the canoe to reach your destination. I will say the closing prayer in the language of my grandmother, and that is the Tokelauan language to close us because of the Tokelauan week today. Let us pray. Te tua de mātou te mana whakatilangi. Hia lele o mātou loto I dou aloha mātou angalelei. Le kua maua e ki mātou te aso o te manu malo. Au mai dou alofa. Au mai dau hakamanuyanga ki mātou uma. E mawai e ki mātou te ola. Heavenly Father, it's a joy for us as a one people, a one family under God, to look after the epistemology of our well-being, but especially to care with love, with compassion, the people, our families, our loved ones, our enemies, so that we may live together in peace. Shalom. Salam alaikum. In your holy name, we pray. We all say, Amen. And may God continue to bless you. Thank you.